Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Kinetics and Incident Responses webinar this morning on the learnings from recent local cyber events. My name's Matt. I'm the COO at Kinetics here, and I'll actually be joined this morning by Campbell McKenzie, who is from Incident Response, and also Bill Lunham, who's our CTO, who will be adding his insights throughout the presentation and be available to answer any questions that we have. So I'm conscious that people are still chiming in. There was a really good response to this webinar this morning. Certainly looking forward to hearing more from Campbell this morning. As a quick introduction, Campbell's business is instrumental in working alongside many legal firms, and as an independent cyber security forensics consultancy. They're engaged in many cases before cyber incidents occur and giving advice to their end user clients, particularly in the legal sector. But they're also involved post the incidents themselves. So that's where I think Campbell can add his specific insights today. So looking forward to hearing from you, Campbell, and welcome to this morning's webinar.
Thank you.
So we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions via the chat session. We have people's microphones muted during the session because there's a lot to get through. I'll just run through some quick housekeeping for everybody. This session is actually being recorded, and the benefit of recording this is that I know you had a lot of people who have registered, but some people can sometimes not attend. We will actually save the recording and post it on our website for people to get access to after this. We'll also save the presentation so that you've got access to the material. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat, as I said, and look forward to seeing the final presentation and the video post this event. So I will hand over now to Campbell to get into the body of his presentation.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Bill, and obviously Andrew and Kinetics Group for coming along and I guess sharing insights, which hopefully will help everyone be in a better position regarding cybersecurity. Just one quick question, Matt. You mentioned you couldn't see my camera earlier. Is that still the case?
No, we can see you loud and clear now, Campbell. Thank you.
Okay, all good, thank you. And will I take the slide deck? Will I take control, or will you be rolling?
I'll work through. How's that?
Okay, sure thing. Okay, thank you. So I guess quick, and thank you for the introduction. And I guess just a little bit further to that. Why do I do what I do today? I found myself when I returned from my Kiwi OE working as a help desk analyst for a large consulting firm here in Auckland. It was a lot of password resets, a lot of updating of antivirus, server engineering, and so on and so forth. But I found the thing that got the most appreciation from my customers, which were the users in the organization, is if A, they lost data and needed to try and recover a file, or B, if there was some sort of investigation that needed to be done. So, working 2.5 years in that role, I found those jobs to be quite interesting. So I thought, how do I get away from doing password resets and do something that I want to do? So at the time in 2002, I applied for and got one of the initial roles at the New Zealand Police Electronic Crime Laboratory, and that was a team of around about 10. I worked there for 4.5 years, and that was obviously criminal cases. It was locating evidence to support traditional crimes. But during that time as well, there was certainly cybercrime was present in New Zealand back in 2002. So I also got a fair bit of experience at dealing with cybercrime from a law enforcement point of view and going through the courts as an expert witness, giving evidence to support the prosecution. I then joined PwC in 2006 and mainly worked for the next number of years on insolvency matters because that was when all the GFC hit. So again, collection of data, processing and assisting law firms review that data for recoveries and prosecutions and so on and so forth. But also there was a fair bit of employment, litigation, discovery, and again, cyber. So the flavour that it has kept coming through, I guess, is that cyber component. Got to work on a number of interesting large-scale cyber attacks around the world, working for a large professional services firm, but also, I guess, working on a number of matters that we weren't quite sure if they were a breach or not and had to be investigated. Like a whole lot of data was being uploaded to a cloud site. Was that an attack, or was it perhaps just a misconfiguration? And I guess I'd say I have had my fair share of assessing, triaging indicators of compromises that perhaps haven't led to full-blown cyber attacks. What changed about 5 or 6 years into my role there was insurance companies started selling insurance policies. So I worked closely with all the local insurers around helping them understand what would a response look like. We were appointed to the panels and we started working on panel incident response jobs. And about 5 years ago, I left that role and set up Incident Response Solutions. So we're a boutique forensic incident response cyber company. We're situated here in Shorten Street. And because of demand, I guess that's a sad thing to have to hear, there is demand for our services. We've just moved in the last month from our current footprint, and we've had to triple that footprint to allow for the growth that we've experienced and where it's heading. So we're currently a team of 6 who predominantly work on helping people prepare for, respond to, and recover from cyber incidents just for New Zealand organisations, and that keeps the 6 of us busy full time. So I guess that gives you a little bit of a flavour as to what is the size of the problem out there. Obviously, we've got 26 people who have joined today that are interested. You might have some concerns around what's happening out there because you're reading about things, or you might have had some near misses. I'm going to start this by saying you need to talk to your provider, Kinetics, about cyber in more detail. Start a conversation. So if you don't do anything after this, except for starting a more detailed conversation, just so you can understand more about it. So I've got a number of slides.
Great advice there. Great advice there. We're here to help. Absolutely.
Good. Yeah. No, you need to talk about it. You need to talk about it. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. Thanks. We might pop through a few of them.
Sorry about that.
It's okay. So what I'm going to firstly do, I'm going to talk about the Verizon data breach investigation report that's just come out. Mine seems to still be showing slide 1, Matt. Not sure about for others.
How about you, Bill? Can you see Verizon data breach?
Yes.
Okay. For some reason, it's not showing on my screen which one it's at. What I'm just going to do while we get that rolling, I'm going to shift that screen to the right because I do have a copy of it locally. And I'm just going to see what we're seeing there until that catches up as such. Okay, so we've got 4 bullet points there. The data breach investigation report was created. It's a summary that comes out every year, which nicely talks to, what are the patterns, what are the trends, and it's also used to help inform organisations with their cybersecurity spend and the like. I think the main thing that comes out of it year after year is it mostly proves that the biggest risk and the biggest mitigation to that risk is the human factor, which leads to sort of a reliance on increased training for staff about cyber. So if we go to the next slide.
Yep.
We can see there was 16,000 odd security incidents. Now, an incident could be anything. It's basically like, I think I read this morning, the New Zealand government or something like that is under a DDoS attack. So a distributed denial of service attack from maybe someone in another country. A DDoS attack is an incident, but it's not a breach. A DDoS attack is just someone trying to deny access to the website. They're not actually getting into the website and the data itself. But what is worse is when there's an actual breach. So 5,199 breaches. So that's where they get access to your data, have a look at it, copy it, post it on the dark web, so on and so forth. This is the 16th edition. Over time, we're hitting 953,000 incidents, 250,000 breaches. If anyone is so inclined, I would encourage you to read it. There's the hyperlink down the bottom there. It's fairly long, about 60 odd pages, but it's an interesting read. It's a worthwhile read, and it will certainly bring your knowledge up. And if we move to the next slide, what are the key statistics? So last year it was around about 82% of all breaches were caused or contributed by humans. This year 74%, slight change down, but it doesn't really change anything. It's still the majority of cases are caused by a human. And what do I mean by that? It's an email being received, a very convincing email, convincing that person to click on the link and download something, which might be a bit of malware, or enter your password and credentials into your Microsoft account. And a lot of people think, well, that won't happen to me. But believe me, it happens all the time. Humans are vulnerable. They get us in our weak moments. They're very convincing. And while, of course, everyone will have multi-factor authentication turned on, I'm sure, and if you haven't already, I'm sure you'll be ringing the guys up and saying, hey, can we please turn on multi-factor authentication? Because the Office of the Privacy Commissioner just last month said an absence of 2FA may lead to a reprimand under the Privacy Act. So you definitely want to be having that turned on. Attackers can still get around it. There's something called multi-factor authentication fatigue. So that's, for example, when you keep getting hammered with a, do you approve, do you approve, do you approve? And eventually a user just says, well, if I click yes, maybe it'll get rid of that message. Yeah, it'll get rid of the message, but the attackers will also get your 2FA code and manage to get into your Microsoft account. So 2FA will make you feel safe, but it still needs your wits about you. The next one is 50% social engineering. So again, this is a form of impacting of the human, but this is really the biggest increase from last year's report. So again, social engineering, just basically impacting the human. It's pretexting that has really increased. So traditionally, these are called man-in-the-middle attacks. It's where an attacker manages to get themselves between the two parties doing the email, and they build up such a convincing story that when they hit you with the crime, which is probably a false invoice or something to that effect, it's just believable because you've pretexted the situation. We've changed our bank, can't pay on this day, we've got to divide it up into amounts, and there's 6 or 7 of those emails or more that go backwards and forwards, that when the final email comes through, that person trusts the person on the email and makes the transaction and loses a lot of money. 24% ransomware, and this is what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today with the impacts on a couple of New Zealand organisations of late. 19% internal actors, so those are most likely to be inadvertent, so attaching the wrong email, attaching the wrong file to an email and sending it off. That's what happened to ACC a number of years ago, and that's what happens every day. Myself, when I attach a file, I sort of relaunch that file, open it up and make sure it's for the right client. The other thing I do is I put the client code that we're dealing with inside of the attachment, and that's also inside of the email. So I match up the client code inside of the subject line, the client code inside of the attachment, make sure the attachment's going to the right place. But also just be mindful, I'm sure you don't have it in any of your organizations, but there are organizations out there that have mules. And there was a story, I think, in this week's Herald. It's a developing story about the police really are quite helpless to be able to find the attackers from overseas. Fair enough. But there are people in New Zealand who are receiving the funds in the first instance. Yeah. So if one of your customers is paying you and they're defrauded, or you're paying someone else, that money, when they change the bank account, will typically go to a New Zealand bank account, which is typically going to either someone here in New Zealand who's been duped and becomes an illegal mule, or it's going to someone who recently had a New Zealand bank account who's decided to sell access to that off. But it's such a big problem, and the article in this week's Herald certainly mentioned that, that it's hard to get on top of.
So did you use the word mules there, Campbell?
Mules, money mules.
Right, so something to keep an eye out for.
Yep, there are New Zealand employees who are money mules. I think it's hard. It would be hard to know if one of your customers attending this call would have someone in their organisation. But all I'm saying is that New Zealanders are being coerced, or into becoming mules. Get rich quick. Make $5,000.
Can I ask a quick question? Because 24% involved ransomware. Often I see statistics that have it a lot lower, and our own New Zealand statistics would suggest that. Is that because perhaps the statistics themselves are taking into account a lot of home user fraud, and whereas ransomware is more likely to be hitting a business?
So this stuff here is all business related. If you're looking at statistics, perhaps from CERT-NZ, the majority of those statistics are all home users.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So skews it away. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go quickly through some of these next slides, Matt. So I think maybe I'll quickly talk to the patterns and what that means. So these are patterns of incidents. The highest occurrence, a denial of service. So again, no data's got in, but just like today's attack on the New Zealand government, which brought down the parliamentary website, I think it was, it's a denial of service attack. Very easy to do. It's an inconvenience. It would really impact people like Trade Me or Xero when people can't access that site, rather than a website where you're happy to go to at a later point in the day.
Good. But
the worst one is breaches. So the next slide down, when your data is actually impacted, it's caused mainly by a system intrusion, or that yellow line there, a web app. So if companies have old style websites that are hosted on perhaps a server and you're not updating it regularly, those are the things that are most at risk. Me, myself, when I set up this business, I went straight to a .com, which hosts my website, the main provider in the world. And I've got 3 websites that are hosted, and they're patching all the time. So one of the biggest causes of breaches is unpatched website software. So if you happen to still run a website and you know it's not on a hosted solution and you're supposed to be looking after it, I'm pretty sure the guys at Kinetics probably don't do the patching of the web servers. You might have another third-party company that look after your website for you. Patch, patch, patch. We go to the next slide. This talks to the 3 things that we most commonly talk about in cyber that impact people: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA. Over time, confidentiality has always been one of the most important things. And if you're a professional services firm, such as a law firm, an accounting firm, an architecture design firm, or whatever it might be, confidentiality is probably going to be critical. Whereas if you are a university that's providing student access systems to do learning, availability is going to be critical, because if people can't get onto the website, then they're going to be obviously heavily impacted. What we can see there's an increase over time on people's concerns about availability, because there's an increase in denial of service attacks. So if you happen to be running some sort of website, or even your own systems, sort of remoting into the cloud or whatever it might be, you need to make sure that your availability and your resilience is high. So for example, when the NZX, Met Service, New Zealand Post, and all those websites were brought down a couple of years ago, they needed to buy additional what's called DDoS mitigation to stop those attacks from occurring. It costs money, but it's like putting extra locks on your door. So it's about assessing your risk. What would impact you the most? How do you mitigate that? And so if we think about confidentiality for a law firm and accounting firm, you absolutely need to be putting lots of locks on your doors, and you need to be thinking about, if there's data that we're holding that we shouldn't be holding any longer, can we archive that off? Can we put it on a hard drive that's not available? Because you should really assume that one day you might get breached. And if you were breached, have as little data as possible. So if you look at the Latitude breach, that's obviously impacted a lot of New Zealanders. The criticism of them has been that they've held on to data that's 20 years old. So there's people that bought a couch on credit 20 years ago that are being notified at the moment. If we drop down to the next slide, what this talks about is how do you discover an incident. Now, I've highlighted the big blue line, and this one is actually from last year's survey, not this year's survey. But the big blue line is sort of like a SOC, a Security Operations Center. So a lot of organizations quite rightly go out and pay for these services, where a third-party company will monitor all of the things that are happening from a cybersecurity point of view in your organization. Now, the SOC, these software systems and the companies that look at the stuff quite rightly rose over time in prominence, and they were the #1 way that you discovered you had an attack. But in recent years, actually, it's dropped right off the cliff. Why is that? It's the amount of data. I'm being told by SOCs it's the amount of data they have to traverse and understand what does bad look like to that organization. The #1 you're going to find out that you're being breached is the attacker themselves. So you'll come into work one morning and your systems may not be working. Yeah, let's touch wood. And I'm not suggesting any Kinetics clients that would happen to them, but that's what's happened when I turn up to these jobs. How did you find out you're attacked? We turned up on Monday morning, the systems didn't work. We walked past the printer and there was 500 pages of ransom notes printed out. You're going to find out through some other method, but the key thing is, and I'll refer you to what's called the NIST cybersecurity framework, is there's 5 things that you should be doing. You need to identify your critical assets. You need to protect your critical assets. You need to have detection systems in place to tell you if something goes wrong. You then need to be able to respond and recover appropriately. So that's the NIST cybersecurity framework that a lot of organizations follow. Okay, and I'll briefly talk about what these two means. How long does it take in a breach back in 2010 versus how long does it take in a breach in 2021? Basically, if we compared those two slides, you'll see that everything is a lot quicker now. It's quicker for the attackers to get in. It's quicker for organizations to detect something's occurring. It's quicker for them to exfiltrate the data, and it's generally quicker for organizations to respond and recover. Why is it quicker for organizations to recover? Because they've got good backup systems in place. Now, I've talked about patching, I've talked about 2FA. The other thing is backups. So certainly what I've seen the most damage in New Zealand after a cyber attack is when people don't have appropriate backups. You need to ensure that you've got immutable backups of your data. That means that the attackers can't delete it. They can't overwrite it. It needs to be a copy that's like in a write protected mode, because when you do get attacked, that's one of the first things they do. They try and delete the backups. Okay, just briefly on ransomware. So we talk about vectors and groups. The screenshot on the left shows patterns over time as to how ransomware occurs. Traditionally, it was through remote access. It certainly spiked a bit with COVID, a lot of people working from home, but then people got good at managing remote access. The trend really is vulnerability. So again, patching. So it's not just your operating system, Windows, making sure your laptops and desktops are all patched with the latest version of Windows. It's also any software that you run. So it can be the smallest bit of software that you hardly ever use. If it's old and out of date and it's got a vulnerability, the attackers might be able to get in through that vulnerability. So vulnerability management is absolutely critical to reduce the chance of a ransomware attack occurring. Over on the right-hand side, look, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the numbers, but it's big and it continues to get bigger. So in the last few months in Australia, the largest law firm got attacked by Black Cat, which is the #1 ranked one there, the group Black Cat, and they took 4,000 gigabytes of data. They asked for many millions of dollars, which the victim decided not to pay to prevent the data from being leaked. And it was all posted about 3 weeks ago up online, so you can download it all. So look, that's a different session to talk about what to do there. But the key point being is that, if you think it's not going to happen to you, or if you think you're immune, it can happen to anyone. And I'm pretty sure Australia's largest law firm paid a lot of attention to security and probably thought they were secure. Ironically, they do legal services for the Australian version of the Privacy Commission.
Yeah.
So all of the emails that were passed between the Australian Privacy Commission, the OAIC, and Australia's largest law firm have all been breached and are now on the dark web. And you can only imagine what sort of information is there. There's also a lot of information from New Zealand law firms, between 2 law firms in New Zealand, for example, that Australian law firm had. So hugely damaging, that very recent attack.
So Just a comment and a question. A comment first of all, if anybody has questions, if you put them in the chat, we will try to deal with those at the end. And Campbell, you're talking about patching then. So I think the point you're making is to go, having of course your Windows up to date, those Microsoft patches are really important, but you need all those other applications. You need your Adobe, you need your VLC video player app that you've downloaded to run something. All those need to be kept up to date as well. Is that correct?
Everything.
Yeah.
So for example, over the weekend, I happened to pull out some Dell laptops and check the Dell Update Manager, and there were 6 critical updates to be run.
Yeah. Okay.
So BIOS updates as well.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we've been working on now. I can't talk in detail about it. They're still live cases, but I can talk in general. So in December, there was an attack on a managed service provider, Mercury IT, which impacted quite a large number of their clients, and it became public because it affected a number of commercial entities who went out publicly and said, we've lost all our data. So there was an insurance company that made mention of that. Te Whatu Ora Ministry of Justice also came out and said that they had lost all of their, well, not all, but a number of their post-mortem files. That sort of ran through December. We were not working directly with the IT company, we were working alongside them, but we were working for customers that were impacted. The critical thing is a lot of the stuff might be outside of your control. So if you're impacted by, let's say it's not Kinetics, but let's say it's something else in the cloud, say you use Dropbox and you lose access to all of your Dropbox, for example, how do you tell your customers that you've lost access to all those files? How do you keep them up to date as you're working through it? How do you do a privacy assessment knowing that those files that were in the Dropbox account that weren't protected with MFA, so on and so forth, and you've had a social engineering attack, that they're not going to appear on the dark web? So obviously a bit of the shock and the startle effect comes in to any organization that's impacted by this, because you suddenly start thinking to yourself, what's the full impact? Now, being New Zealand, being local providers, they were very good with their communications and keeping everyone up to date as quickly as possible, but it's never enough. I know that customers will feel that's never enough. So the key thing is hopefully after listening to today's session, you'll go away and start thinking about the sorts of things that you might do should you face this situation. It's a bit like a first aid course. You never want to have to do CPR, but if you had to do CPR, how do you do it? And you write yourself an incident response plan, you have yourself a communication statement, you know who to call in an incident, you know whether or not, if you've got insurance, you have to notify them and discharge your obligations, you know about your legal requirements under the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, if you're a law firm, under your client conduct care rules, if you're a financial advisory business, under the Financial Markets Authority. So for the OPC, you must notify them within 72 hours. That's their expectation if you've been breached. The Law Society as well. The FMA have 10 days before you need to notify them, but they're all still things that you need to do. Okay, so the key point being planning in advance. What happened though with the Mercury attack, though, is eventually, it became very public because the data was all put onto a dark website. There was a posting saying that all of these customers of the IT company were about to have their data leaked, and eventually that data was all leaked in January. It was about a 7-week period, and those 7 weeks are obviously quite a nervous time for any organisation while they're waiting to know whether or not their data might get leaked on the dark web. But yeah, I think it was about mid-January, the data that was threatened to be leaked was all put out there, downloadable by anyone. Fast forward to about June, and then there was an attack on a managed service provider called Landtech. Again, very public information. A lot of customers have gone out and talked about that. I'm obviously not going to be talking about the case itself because, as I say, we're helping customers through it. But again, learnings from that, it's exactly the same thing. Communications. So how do you ensure that all of your customers will feel like you're in control of the situation? It's all very well and good for you to say it was an attack on a third party, but it's your responsibility as an organization. You're responsible for your data. You need to be able to fulfill your obligations and notify everyone and keep them up to date with what needs to occur. But again, the key things are social engineering. So when your wider data set is attacked, be it on a third party, you need to tell all of your staff, hey, some of our data might have been accessed by attackers. They might be selling that on the dark web, and we might be susceptible to attackers emailing us and telling us and trying to convince our staff to do things, because now they know a lot more about us and our organization. So again, the alert needs to go up. And you can be at a heightened sense of alert for months, and that's quite exhausting as well. But by notifying all your staff, training them about the risks, knowing to look out for false invoices and suspicious emails and so on and so forth, you can reduce the risk of something occurring to you. On the lessons learned, and I know we're sort of going to run out of time, so what have I got, a couple of minutes to wrap up?
Absolutely.
Okay, sure. So if you just want to drop down to slide 17, we've got the NIST cybersecurity framework with the circle there.
Yes.
I would recommend people just Google NIST cybersecurity framework and have a quick read of what all that means, but I've already talked to that one. And then if you go down to the next slide, CIS Controls, that stands for Center for Internet Security Controls. This is probably what we spend most of our time with our clients on, helping them be better prepared. Well, A, to try and prevent attacks, and B, to be better prepared should an incident occur. But there's 18 controls. And if you go to the next slide, it talks about implementation group level 1, 2, and 3. Most New Zealand organisations would be at an implementation group level 1. And there's a number of 56 there. What that means is across those 18, there's a couple of sub-controls under each of those numbers, which make up 56. So if you look at, for example, the CERT top 10, that's 10 things that you should do, 2FA, backups, so on and so forth. CIS suggests 56 things to do. The CERT 10 are good, but I would suggest 56 things to do is better and still manageable. And then on the next sort of slides, which I guess everyone will receive anyway, is just a screenshot on number 20 of controls 1 through to 6. Those are sort of your fundamental controls. So know your hardware, know your software, know your data, make sure you've securely configured it all, especially your Microsoft 365. Make sure you've got good account management, so your onboarding process, your offboarding process, and then make sure you've got good access control management. So, you know, what's a user allowed to see? What's an admin allowed to access? And ideally, an admin should only be using an admin account when they need to. You don't want to have shared user and admin accounts. So, you know, that's just a high-level overview of what's on that first slide there. And then it goes through on the next slide, 21, into vulnerability management, audit log management. So a lot of people have an absence of logs. The more, the better. And then there's a bunch of other controls there, including data recovery. I'd highly recommend people do not only the level 1 or 4, but I'd also suggest you do number 5, which is to test your backups. It's all very well and good to be thinking you're making backups, but, you know, have you tested them? So in the case of those New Zealand examples of those IT companies, the reason Te Whatu Ora had to come out and say we've lost coronial data is because they didn't have an immutable copy of that data, and it probably wasn't being tested. They probably thought all that was being done, but it's not your IT company's ultimate responsibility. It's your responsibility to making sure that your IT company are doing those things for you. You need to ask, have that conversation, make sure you feel comfortable that all these high-risk areas are being addressed. And then on the final list of all those CIS controls, number 14 is security training and awareness. That takes up 8 of the 56 safeguards. And that just reflects, if we go all the way back to the start of about the Verizon data breach report, 74% of attacks have some sort of human element. So the CIS controls, which updates itself each year based on the Verizon data breach report, knows that you should spend most of your time and money on security training and awareness. 80% of your security budget should be going towards security training and awareness if it's not already. If you feel like you're on top of that, allocate that to other areas as well. That's a rough guideline, but all I'm emphasizing, make sure your staff undertake regular cybersecurity training and awareness. So that wraps up the content. Sorry, I'm a little bit over there as to what I wanted to try and provide. On the next slide there, if anyone was interested and wanted to have a further discussion, those are the sorts of things we do. But I think you've heard enough from me. I'm going to wrap up there, and I'll stand by for questions and any other comments from the Kinetics team. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Campbell. That was a really insightful presentation, and particularly coming from a New Zealand focused perspective, you having such exposure to New Zealand specific attacks and what organisations you're consulting with should be doing to protect themselves absolutely aligns with what you talked about with the NIST framework, and that's the framework that we've used for our cybersecurity offerings. And we would welcome the opportunity to speak to anyone. Thank you for your time today. And as I said to all people on the webinar, we've got a video of this which we will share afterwards, and also a copy of this presentation. And please feel free to ask any of your account managers for follow-up information as and when required. So thank you for your time today. Really appreciated your contribution to the webinar, and thanks for everyone. Cheers.